Okay, so I thought I would do a little zoom on how best to answer a paper 2 question 3. So I've obviously sent you this information already so that you can see this, but I thought I'd talk you through it. So the first thing I want you to do then is just have a read of the extract that's on the right. And then from that extract, I just want you to think about all the adjectives that you can pick out from there. So we've got the poor child, although the weather was severe, was dressed in a thin cotton gown with a threadbare shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She wore no covering to her head, and the long rusty hair stood out in all directions. When she walked, she shuffled along for fear that the large carpet slippers that served her for shoes would slip off her feet. So just give you a couple of seconds just to pick out some adjectives that you see in there of how she is described, and obviously, of course, how what she's wearing or behaving is described. Okay, so some things you could have picked out then were the words poor, severe, threadbare. Threadbare means obviously barely there at all in terms of the material that her item is made of. Her hair is described as long and rusty. Rusty obviously with a connotation of being sort of unkept and in not very good condition. And then the fact that her slippers are described as large suggests essentially that they're either second-hand or not hers. So what sort of emotions do we feel like? How do we feel about the girl described? I mean, if you take the fact that, you know, it talks about obviously how poor she is in terms of her threadbare and her unkeptness, but actually by saying the poor child, you've obviously got the two connotations of what the word poor means, not necessarily poor financially, but also the writer there is telling us that we feel sorry for the child by saying the poor child. Okay, so a paper 2 question 3 then is all about picking out language, picking out technique. Now, paper 2 question 3 is the same as a paper 1 question 2. There's exactly the same skills that you would have shown before. So you've covered this style of answering in the past. So you'd always be given an extract in the exam, and I've attached the extract for you as well, okay, so that you can use this and highlight as we go along at home. The little watercress girl who gave me the following statement, although only 8 years of age, had entirely lost all childish ways, and was, indeed, in thoughts and manner, a woman. There was something cruelly pathetic in hearing this infant, so young that her features had scarcely formed themselves, talking of the bitterest struggles of life with the calm earnestness of one who had endured them all. I did not know how to talk with her. At first I treated her as a child, speaking on childish subjects, that I might, by being familiar with her, remove all shyness and get her to narrate her life freely. The poor child, although the weather was severe, was dressed in a thin cotton gown with a threadbare shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She wore no covering to her head, and the long rusty hair stood out in all directions. When she walked, she shuffled along for fear that the large carpet slippers that served her for shoes would slip off her feet. Okay, so in order for you to understand how to answer that question, we're going to go through what does a paper 2 question 3 want. So we'll only ask you to refer to the one source. In this case, it's source B. And it says, how does the writer use language to describe the watercress girl? So you're looking for, there's 12 marks there, so you're looking for 4 to 5 different ways that the writer has used language. It could be a language technique, it could be a word class, it could be sentence type. So for example, where there's been a short sentence used or a one-word sentence. So as well as picking out a technique, you can also pick out like just one particular word that strikes you, that stands out for you. Or like we did with the starter when we were looking at the word poor, the connotations of the word poor, both in wealth and also allowing us to have empathy, sympathy for the girl. So you need to grab your highlighter or a pencil or some form of way of underlining, please, guys. And you also need your extract. If you haven't been able to print it off, that's okay. You could just make notes down on a piece of paper, or you can highlight it on your computer, or you can use your notes, or whatever form way it's best for you to document. And remember, when you're highlighting, you're looking for how the writer uses language to describe the girl. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. Okay, you should have 3 or 4 things. Don't worry if you haven't, you've only got 2. Remember the technique we always spoke about in class, which was obviously why you're highlighting, obviously annotate the 2 things as well. So what word class is it? Or what technique is it? And then what can you infer from it? So you've obviously seen the question is about the language used to describe the girl. So how is that girl described based on what you've highlighted? I've given you an example of some on here as well. So you've got, although only 8 years old, I think the use of the numerical 8 years of age reminds us actually how young she is. I know she's described as little, but it actually makes us think about, you know, sort of how young she is. And I think as well, I haven't highlighted it, but I actually really like the use of the adverb entirely lost all childish ways, almost giving the indication like she's had to grow up so quickly that almost her childhood has been forgotten. Cruelly pathetic, again, almost like as a society or as an individual reading this piece, we would feel so sorry for the fact that, you know, we've got this person in front of us who's lost all her childish ways, and almost we feel sorry for her because it's been cruelly taken from her. So the use of, again, of the adverb cruelly. So young that her features are scarcely formed. Again, just another reminder of how young and innocent she obviously appears to us. And yet then, just after that, talking of the bitterest struggles of life. So we know, therefore, or we can infer that she's obviously gone through things that somebody of her age should never have had to deal with. I treated her as a child speaking on childish subjects, so that I might, by being familiar with her, obviously we talk about there how the writer, by being familiar with her, is trying to get to know her, trying to learn more about her. And then again, like we saw in the starter, the poor child. So again, you've highlighted the word poor, the adjective poor. You've got the indication there of not only that she is poor within wealth, but also that we've got that empathy for her. And although the weather was severe, and I think the use of describing the weather as severe, you know that weather, of course, means, I can all hear you shouting pathetic fallacy. It's actually an indicator for setting the mood about that. Dressed in a thin cotton gown, threadbare shawl wrapped over her shoulders. She wore no covering to her head, long rusty hair, and then obviously the enlarged slippers that would slip off her feet. So it really paints that image. The writer paints an image of somebody who is certainly living in poverty and has had a really difficult life. Okay, so then it's your turn to answer the question now in your book. So you've taken the time to annotate it. What does the question want you to do? So it's basically just a P paragraph. Make your point. The writer uses the language technique of the adjective poor. The adjective poor describes the watercress girl both as poor in wealth, so we know that she's living in poverty, but also so that as an audience or as a reader, we have empathy for the girl in terms of how she's described. You could also, again, it's just a basic P paragraph. You're only looking for 3 to 4 of these. You could take back and use the features had scarcely formed themselves, and use that, and you could almost pepper in there with how they'd scarcely formed themselves and the bitterest of struggles. So the idea of how innocent image is being created of how she looks, but actually how mentally she's scarred from those bitterest of struggles. Now remember, you're only going to get marks for making a point about how the writer uses the language. So you're going to get a mark for picking out a quote, you're going to get a mark for saying what technique it is, but your big money is on how the writer describes her. And that's where you're looking for you to be able to pepper in and to really get inside the writer's head and, you know, really decipher what message it is in terms of how the writer wants this watercress girl to come across to us. For those of you a bit concerned about watercress, it's obviously set in the Victorian era, and so she's obviously selling watercress. So I didn't mean to get confused about that. And so what I'm aiming for you to do now is I want you to have a go in your books or in your notebook or on some paper or on a computer if that's easier for you. And I want you to have a go at that question. How I've designed this PowerPoint is obviously, you can look back through this. I've obviously attached this in, so you can have a look where I've modeled the example. But of course, the other thing is you can obviously listen back to this recording. So if I've missed anything or you've missed anything I said the first time, then obviously you can check in with me. I've also attached for you the Language Paper 2 flashcards. On there is the mark scheme as well, so you can see what's required from it. But just to remind you, you've got your AO1, which is where you're making your point, you're picking out your key area from there. Your AO2, where you're referring back to your quotes and the language. And then you've got your AO3, which is where you're really deciphering and inferring what the writer is trying to get across about the watercress girl. There's a structure on there for you. If, for those of you who I know like to use your writing guides, you can use those there. Remember, with think, feel, or imagine, you only need to pick one. And you don't need to have, you can use the use of the keyword if you've quoted in the evidence section a full quote. But if you haven't and you've just picked out one word, you don't have to repeat that word again. You wouldn't lose marks if you did, but you don't want to end up making it too wordy and then tripping yourself up with it. You'll note at the top there where I put annotate to plan. So important. So important. I gave you that the chance when we went over it as a group, but if you haven't, I really encourage you before you put pen to paper to have a go at annotating through your ideas there. And then I think it's really important for you to, as we would have done in the lessons in terms of self-reflection, you know, how have you improved your understanding? And we're going to do a series of paper 2 question 3s because it's worth so many marks, but actually you already know these skills. So it's just about us going back through and making sure we are clear on all of those things. Okay, so that's me on paper 2 question 3. I'll continue to upload them like this. Any feedback, any information, an extra you want me to go through. I'm also going to do a series of these for lit, so we can go through some characters and themes and context. Obviously, more than welcome to. Anything you need particularly, please pop me a little email on Show My Homework. Stay safe. Miss you all a lot. Take care.